In this video, we'll be looking at speaking and talking. Now, they're both the same thing, but we'll be using acronyms where each letter stands for a word. Speaking is an acronym designed by Del Hymes, a famous linguist, talking about things that need to be considered in any speech event. And then talking is something that I developed when we were doing a talk for ELMD, giving practical tips for constructing a presentation. So first, tell us about the speaking grid.
As we can see, speaking grid is SPEAKING acronym. S, setting. In other words, setting is very much like a scene. For example, now we are doing a video recording. This setting provides the environment for us to talk. And in front of us is actually our digital media designer, Wendy, who is listening to us. And while we are talking to each other, this kind of setting, the temperature, the location, the time, and so on, will set the tone for what we talk about, how we talk about it. Even, whether there's water, whether there's a table, and how we sit next to each other will influence how we interact with each other.
Mm-hmm. And we have to always keep looking at the camera rather than at one another, even when we're talking to one another, in order to get a good recording. So the setting implies who can speak, how formal it should be, and how we interact. For instance, in iGEM, when you're doing your final presentation, it makes a difference whether you're face-to-face or, as happened for many years during COVID, you're online. It makes a difference whether you're in a large lecture hall with lots of people watching or a small room, whether there are other observers in the room, whether it's local people or a large group from overseas.
And when you do thesis oral defense, or we call it viva voce, in that setting, sometimes it's face-to-face, sometimes it's online, depending on whether COVID is over or not. And in that classroom, you can see how the room is set up. That will influence how people feel or view about this whole text.
Right, sometimes the presenter stands on one side, sometimes they stand in the middle, sometimes they try to stand in the back and hide, even though they should be the focus, not the PowerPoint.
And sometimes there are other graduate students around, just to give support or to watch.
What about the participants, P?
Participants. So for example, now, in this room, there are 3 participants, right? Both of us plus Wendy, who's doing the recording for us. And in this case, who is our audience? Of course, it's not Wendy, although once in a while we have to watch her reaction to see if what we're talking about makes sense. And we have our direct audience, which is our students, right? In iGEM presentations or in master students in education or in applied linguistics.
And so again, the participants, in this case, there are 2 of us who are speaking, even though there are 3 of us in the room, and it's expected that we are the only ones who will be speaking in this.
Exactly, and we also imagine there will be people, in the world watching us via the video. So they are our imagined participants too.
Right. So in iGEM, the participants make a difference. For instance, the judges, are they young? Are they old? Are they male? Are they female? Do they smile? Do they frown? All of those are going to have an impact on your team as you walk in. Are the other team members in the room or are they in a separate room? Are there other teams there?
And in viva voce or oral defense, it also depends on who these committee members are. Are you familiar with them? Are they new? Or are they authoritative? Are they assistant professors? And so on. They are all related factors, who these participants are, will influence how you present your oral defense.
And then E. E is for ends.
Ends. What's the goal? What's the purpose of the speech event? Now we are talking. What's the purpose? We are trying to explain things in detail to teach students to do better presentation.
But the goal may be different for the speaker and the judges. The speaker is trying to appear knowledgeable. The judges are trying to determine what award level or what grade should be given. So the ends implies something about the presentation ability. You try to hide things that you're not so confident about and stress the things that you are confident about or that are more important. So in team competition, again, in iGEM, you're trying to get a higher medal. And the judges are trying to determine what medal you should get. But you can't always assume that they have read the wiki, that they know your material. So your end has to be both to explain and to persuade.
But in oral defense, all the committee members have already read your thesis. So your purpose is not to repeat the whole thing. You only have 20 minutes. So during the 20 minutes, you have to talk about your methods and the results and justify your methods and provide extensive analysis of your results.
And then A is the act sequence. What does that mean?
For example, act sequence, we are talking now. And you usually begin, right? Then after that, you give me signal so I can get the permission to talk, right? That's the act sequence. And after we finish, you conclude our talk. So we do have turn taking.
Okay, so the act sequence implies there's a beginning, there's an ending, and in the middle, different people may or may not be able to interrupt depending on what their role is. And there's an expected order that you follow in a presentation. So again, in iGEM, the beginning is very important. You have to catch the audience's attention. And then how you transfer from one person to another to maintain continuity. And the questions and answers that are at the end. Those are a very important part of the presentation.
In oral defense, the convener will announce, now the examination begins. Then the student will take 20 minutes to do an oral presentation. And after that, we will begin the Q&A, usually starting with the person the farthest, the furthest, the distant from us, either location-wise, geographically, or department-wise. So there's a certain act sequence.
Okay, and then key. K is for key. What does that mean?
Key, just like when you play music, you can have a more casual or formal key, higher or lower, right? Same thing, you can use it as a metaphor. When we talk, we can be very serious, very formal, stiff, or we can be very relaxed, talking to each other, joking about things.
Okay. So the key implies how people should talk, how they should respond based on that level of formality, seriousness, or whatever else.
Just like when you sing a song, what kind of key? You use higher key or lower key? High pitch, low pitch, that will influence the result of your song.
Okay, so in iGEM, the intent is that it's cooperative, that the judges are trying to help you. And it's a professional atmosphere, but you have to make your presentation attractive because you're trying to sort of sell your product at the same time.
In oral defense too, it is a time you present your best work. You want to show off, your performance, and you want to impress the audience so that you have a higher score.
And then I is instrumentality. Again, that's a word that you use in linguistics, but what does that mean?
For example, right now we are making the recording. what instruments are we using? It's not only our speech, we also have PPT in front of us, right? And we also have a video camera shooting our interaction. These are all instrumentality that influence how we talk to each other, how we look at the camera, how we respond to each other's questions. That's instrumentality.
Okay, so it's the instruments that are used in the communication.
And sometimes we might use animation, pictures to illustrate our point. These are all different instruments.
So the things that get put on the screen later,
Yes.
the words that get put on the screen, those are instruments that help convey the message as well.
Exactly.
So again, in iGEM, the PowerPoint helps to explain and clarify. You can put words on the screen that are very important words. You can use animation, tables, figures.
In oral defense, we've already read long thesis. The committee members want you to use figures, tables, examples to illustrate your point. That's instrumentality.
Okay? And then N is norms, the social expectations that go along with communication. For instance,
For example, we are living in a discourse community. Any discourse community has its standard. In academic discourse, in humanities and social sciences, we have our expectation and our standards. In science engineering, you have your expectations. That's the so-called norm. So when we talk, doing an academic presentation, we want to use formal English. We choose the language that's expected. For example, English as a lingua franca. And we also adjust our volume, our speed to indicate whether our community feels this should be, louder, faster, or slower.
but still there's some expectations in professional communication. You don't go along very, very fast because nobody will understand you. And you don't go very slow for the same reason.
You don't read word by word. That's a no-no.
So again, in iGEM, the norm is English communication because you're talking about different people understanding all around the world. The number of speakers in the final presentation is limited. And the non-speakers usually will be the ones that are recording any comments from the judges, not the speakers themselves. And there are fixed time limits for the presentation and for the question and answer period.
In oral defense, we also have a fixed time. Within 2 hours, we have to finish everything. So the norm is if you are expected to speak English, do it in English or do it in Chinese. There's certain norm. And you are also supposed to record the process. So when you go back, the student can revise your thesis. And also the norm is after you finish your presentation and the Q&A, you are expected to step outside for a while as the committee members are discussing about what scores they will assign to you.
And finally, genre. This is actually one of the things that you think about at the beginning, but it's at the end because of this acronym. What does genre mean? Genre
is also like register. So in different situations, you use different styles, different register, and different genre. For example, in classroom talk, you have certain style, certain expectation, right? You begin by talking about what we're gonna address today. Then you use illustrations. And then after you finish, you summarize what you have done. That's class talk, right? And you can also have thesis defense. I already mentioned the procedures. And also conference presentation. Within a certain time, you have to do this IMRD structure. And in a job interview, you put on certain type of clothes and you walk in and respond to the questions to show your best performance. There's certain genre for each kind of talk and speech event.
So for a thesis defense, a conference paper, a job interview, you may be talking about your research. It's all the same material, but they're different genres, and therefore you present them somewhat differently in each situation. Similarly with iGEM, you have lab progress reports that may be given among your lab in Chinese. You have practice sessions with practicing the presentation with coaches. And those are different than the final presentation because your purpose is to get comments, not to be the final presentation.
And for oral defense, the genre, mostly the Q&A genre, you are expected to answer the questions. Sometimes students get so nervous, they don't know what to say. That defeats the purpose. The genre is, in the Q&A, I ask you a question, you give me an answer. If it's, you don't know what to say, that's a good question. I need to think about it.
So the speaking grid, again, talks about a lot of sort of general principles that are true in any speaking situation. On the other hand, I developed this talking grid specifically for my students to give practical steps for preparing a PowerPoint in order. And so it begins with T, with the titles. I suggest that you go through and lay out all of your basic ideas on slides, one idea per slide. Give each slide a title, put a few keywords, and then the second step is to add. Add slides, cut slides, think about your argument, make sure you cover all the main ideas. Eliminate unnecessary or duplicate ideas. For instance, you might say, well, I have titles and keywords, I want to organize, I want to cut and add, I want to linearize. Oh, and then you realize linearize is the same as organize, so I don't need that one. And maybe I should say add and cut instead of cut and add, because I want to add before I cut. So I replace some things. And then the third step is to linearize, to put the slides in a reasonable order. Think about your argument, your audience, what they need to know. And then key. Now I use the same word as in the speaking grid, but meaning a very different thing here. To illustrate the key ideas. Illustrate graphs, illustrations, figures, tables. These are very important in a PowerPoint because you don't have a lot of time. And you want to show just the main ideas, not all the details. You can't show all of the details in a PowerPoint that you would in writing. Then I. I stands for interest. You have to get the audience's attention. You have to have an interesting introduction and conclusion. Think about, why should the audience listen to you? Why is your work important? What have you accomplished? Start with a story. Start with a startling statistic, something that will get their attention. And then next, you have to keep the audience's attention. Not too many, not too few slides, about 1 or 2 per minute. Not too much on one slide at one time. If you have a lot of information, use animations to bring things on one at a time so that it's not distracting. There's not too many things there. But make sure that the animations emphasize your point. If you're talking about down, use an animation that moves down. Make it so that it adds to your presentation rather than being distracting. Similarly, transitions. Using a fade can help keep the slide, keep things in continuity. But between major parts, between, say, methods and results, you could bring on a slide with a different transition that's noticeable to mark that change for your audience. And finally, G is goofs. Proofread. Correct all your mistakes. Make sure that everything is as good as possible before you do your final presentation. So this is the talking grid. Again, it shows the major ideas in order. And as you're doing, one thing that you suggested that your students need to do is respond to 3 challenges.
1, I know it already.
So don't waste their time on things that the audience already knows.
2, I don't believe it.
So make sure that you show evidence and reasoning to support your claims.
3, I don't care.
So show the importance, make it interesting so your audience does care about what you care about.